Hello, my name is Camila Cigarroa Kennedy with the Houston Education Research Consortium, or HERC for short. HERC is a research practice partnership between Rice University and 11 public school districts in and around the Houston area. Thank you for joining me today as we discuss findings from our Student Mobility and Continuous Enrollment Project. Today our talk will focus on returners, or students who depart from traditional Texas public schools, and whether or not they return later on. Specifically, we intend to answer the question, do students who leave the Texas public school system eventually return? To answer this question, this presentation proceeds in two parts. The first part focuses on students who leave the Texas public school system entirely. These students could be going to private schools, home schools, out of state, or even moving to another country. Because they are leaving the Texas public school system, we do not have data on where they're going, but we can determine if they ever return. For part two, we will focus on students who leave traditional Texas public school districts for charter schools, specifically non-district charter schools in Texas. So, do students who leave traditional Texas public schools return? We find very different answers depending on where students go. For students who leave the Texas public school system entirely, that is those who are going to private schools or schools in another state, for instance, the vast majority of these students do not return. In other words, once a student leaves the Texas public school system, they tend not to return. In contrast, students who leave for charter schools tend to return to traditional Texas public schools. Moreover, the majority of these students who return come back either prior to or during the transition into high school. Okay, let's look at these findings in more detail. For part one, we focus on students who left the Texas public school system entirely. We started this analysis by looking at all fifth graders in 10 public school districts in and around the Houston area during the 2010 and 11 school year. There were a total of 49,500 students. We followed these students through the 2017-18 school year when most of them would be starting their 12th grade year. We tracked these students in the data to see if they left the Texas public school system at any point between 5th and 9th grade, and if they did, whether or not they returned. We found that about 10% of the cohort left the Texas public school system. That's about 5,000 students. The most common departure point was the school year and summer following the 5th grade, though slightly more than a quarter of students left during the 8th grade. Of those students who left, around 68% did not return. That is, 2 out of every 3 students who left did not return. But for those students who did return, more than half returned in middle school and another quarter came back during the first year of high school. Finally, for those students returning, about 75% returned to the Houston area and slightly more than half returned to their original district. So, in summary, for part one, about 10% of students left the Texas public school system between 5th and 9th grade. Of those who left, most, around 68%, did not return. But for those students who did return, they typically came back during middle school or the first year of high school. Now, let's take a look at the findings from part two of this study. A quick reminder, part two focuses on students who left traditional Texas public schools for a charter school. Once again, we used data from a cohort of 5th graders in the Houston area during the 2010-11 school year that we followed through the 2017-18 school year to see if and when they left for a charter school. One thing we did for part two is a little different from part one. Because charter schools are considered public schools in Texas, when students leave traditional Texas public schools for charter schools, the students' data still shows up in TEA's collections. As a result, we know where students are, and therefore we were able to look at students leaving for charter schools at any time from 5th grade through 12th grade, whereas we were not able to do that when examining students who exited the Texas public school system entirely. So, looking to see how many students left traditional public schools for charter schools starting from the 5th grade, we found that about 11% of students left for charter schools at some point between 5th and 12th grade. That's slightly more than 5,500 students in total. Of these students that left, 32%, or nearly 1 in 3, left during or immediately after their 5th grade year. Another 30% left during typical middle school years, that is grades 6, 7, and 8. Finally, around 20% left during or immediately after their 9th grade year. In this way, we see two moments of mass exodus for charter schools, towards the end of elementary school and at the beginning of high school. So, about 5,500 students left for a charter school at some point. Of those students, more than half returned. Specifically, about 58% of students who departed for a charter school subsequently returned to traditional Texas public schools. For those that returned, the most common re-entry point was ninth grade, with about 33% or 1 in 3 students returning. Still, while ninth grade served as the most common re-entry point, returners came back across the grade span, including around 40% who came back during middle school. In summary, for part 2, about 11% of students left traditional Texas public schools for a charter school at some point between 5th and 12th grade. The school year and summer following 5th grade was the most common time for students to leave. But for these students who left for charter schools, the majority of them returned to traditional Texas public schools. This finding is different from what we observed for students who left Texas public schools entirely. Finally, the majority of returning students came back into traditional Texas public schools either before or during the transition into high school. So, what does all this mean? Do students who leave traditional Texas public schools return? We often hear the narrative that students leave traditional public schools for charter schools or other education settings, only to return later on, and public schools are left to figure out what the student has learned or may have missed in the course of these transitions across different settings. So, is this narrative true? What we see in the data presents a slightly more complex story. For starters, in thinking about the takeaways from part 1, the answer seems to be largely no. Students who exit the Texas public school system entirely, whether it be to attend private schools, religious schools, home schools, or schools in other states, these students do not tend to return. In contrast, findings from part 2 show that students who left traditional public schools for charter schools do typically return. And while many returned in 9th grade, students returned across the grade span, including around 40% who came back during middle school. So, what are the implications of these findings? First, there appears to be a revolving door function of charter schools to some degree in the Houston area. For some students, this revolving door appears to spin very quickly, with them returning to traditional public schools in a matter of months, while for others it is a bit slower as students return years later. Students who leave traditional public schools and the Texas public school system entirely, there is some returning that takes place, but to a much lesser degree. Importantly, this study does not look at the consequences of the revolving door on students' performance and eventual educational attainment, so it is not clear what the impact of these multiple moves may be for student learning. Still, these findings lay the foundation for future inquiries. And while we may not know the exact consequences to students' learning of these returner patterns of student mobility, we do know that reducing the number of students departing for charters would work to reduce a district's need to reincorporate students into their district later on. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions about what we've presented today or additional feedback, please contact Dan Potter at the email address or phone number shown here, or Catherine Bao at the email on screen. Lastly, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page to be notified of future releases of research looking at student mobility and other studies going on here at HERC. Again, thank you for your time and have a good day.